So we had a little bidding war, and table 3 gave me the best bribe, so they're going first. Then we have table 7 and table 9. We're going to get through 3 of these. We're going to stop the discussion by 4:30 and do some wrap up then from there. So Ron, we're going to try to keep this short. We got 3 tables and some general comments and last things, so we got to keep it tight today. Okay.
We are so eager to be first because we strongly believe that these 2 categories we've selected, protocol development and then the recruitment one, are the real game changers in this whole product development arena. We started with protocol development, and the column of purpose and use begins with, this is a critical way to inform protocol design. And the way we're doing this in our particular disease group is the companies, even before they have a therapeutic candidate, come to us and start doing their background investigation. But when they do have a candidate, they come to us and spend a full day or day and a half, and they assemble our KOLs, including our clinical and basic investigators, our patients, our patient advocacy organization, and they mine with those people our natural history data. They begin to design their protocol. They don't come to us with a protocol and say, this is what we're going to use. They come to us and say, what should the protocol say? And so it starts with such things as eligibility, what inclusion, exclusion criteria, what's the perfect population, looking at your natural history, what's the perfect population for our therapeutic candidate. And we'll design our inclusion, exclusion criteria around what you tell us. We'll also design our primary and secondary endpoints, and there will be endpoints that report on the most important symptoms to your patients, and they're endpoints that are sufficiently sensitive to detect biological impact on those symptoms that are important to your patients. We will also inform the procedures in the trial so that the procedures in the trial are tolerable to your patients. They will reflect the fact that these patients can't be given 15 different examinations in a single day, and you expect that the data from those examinations will be valid. You're going to space out those examinations. You're going to take into account how far that patient traveled, what kind of breakfast they had, and what their natural history reflects and what they can tolerate. So those are the really key issues that we can help our sponsors develop. And what are the methods and sources of information? We assemble our patients and the patient advocates, our KOLs, basically an advisory group that helps these companies design their protocol.
And then you're identifying some of these gaps over here, right?
Then the gaps
lead to this research proposal, right? So you've got some really important gaps I see around.
Yeah, we do.
Stats keep showing up, right? Statistics.
One of the gaps we identified was that it's very important, as a couple of the speakers mentioned, to determine the value added of patient engagement. And we need much more of that. The metrics for the value added are important to sponsors that don't quite get it yet. I've heard sponsors in some disease spaces say, we don't understand why you want to engage the patient early on.
Oh my.
Because we've been doing oncology trials for 50 years. We know how to do them. We don't need the patient's involvement until we're recruiting a phase 2B or a phase 3. Well, bologna sausage.
Nice. No, I thought that was marvelously put on a publicly recorded event. Yes, that was very well done. Thank you. There were no beeps needed.
And before going on with that, I think Mark had a good non-technical gap that he. Okay.
So is this around the mindset of the trial designers or the training for the scientists sort of thing? Is that?
No, we'll come back to it. We'll come back to it. We'd like to go on to the next one with recruitment and retention and so forth.
And is that another row? Do we need to move this up?
We'll go to the next row.
Okay, so Melvin,
we're going to pull them together.
If you can bring us up a little bit here. There we go, recruitment, that's the one you were looking for.
Right. Our summary statement on this is that we can, using patient engagement, we can recruit quickly and efficiently so as to enroll promptly and effectively, minimizing screen failures and dropouts and maximizing compliance. And I think those are all fairly golden terms to our sponsor partners. The method we use is much the same. We use contact with our patient groups. We use our patient registries, our contact registries, to recruit the right patients for the right trial. So our patient registry has enough clinical data in it to compare against the inclusion-exclusion criteria that the company gives us. So we can identify patients that have the right, that will meet those inclusion and exclusion criteria and that live close enough to the sites to participate effectively. And as soon as the sponsor tells us time to push the button, we push the button, and we recruit the right patients for the right trial very quickly. We've recruited 60 to 90 patient trials in a matter of hours, and then the enrollment takes place. And because the inclusion-exclusion criteria have already been considered in our recruitment, we do the enrollment without a single screen failure, and the trial is conducted without a single amendment and without a single dropout. So these are all powerful tools of the way the patients and their organizations can assist.
So Ron, is that going to lead then to a way to scale this up beyond your group? Is that the proposal for the research agenda?
Beginning with a gap, and that gap is that not all patient organizations have a registry like that. Not all patient organizations have a natural history database like that. And so the sponsors can sometimes step in and try to assist them conducting that kind of natural history study and developing that kind of patient registry. And so the bottom line is that using these protocol development tools with patients and the retention and recruitment tools with these patients, you're really putting your therapy on trial. You're not putting on trial, if you get a failure, the therapy failed. It wasn't the protocol design. So,
yeah, that's exciting because that's not always clear whether it was one or the other.
Exactly.
So that's
now,
really important.
I'll ask my table colleagues if they'd like to add anything.
This is Mark Budin from National Health Council. One of the gaps that was up that you may have seen was a need to have new statistical modeling. One of the examples we highlighted, and there were a couple.
Row one, the row right above this. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, so for example, if you do a better job with your clinical trial protocols and you're doing a double-arm study and the people in the placebo arm have a better experience, it's entirely likely you're going to get a better placebo effect. And how does that impact the decision-making at the regulatory level when you look at both arms, and how does it impact what a sponsor might do when it's designing its trial? I think it's something we can overcome, but it's a good question for us to look at. How do we overcome it, and what are the modeling options for that?
Excellent.
Yeah,
Thank you, Mark.
Just one thing, that the other statistical modeling gap, but I think we're getting there, is that if we broaden eligibility criteria to be more inclusive in trials, then there is a call for segmentation of the data. So we want to see if older patients are responding differently or have different side effect profile than younger patients, et cetera. And you need the power in your study to do that. And there is some new statistical modeling to account when you broaden your eligibility criteria. So that's something that is I think it's a growing field that's really interesting, that could help.
Great.
Yeah.
Let's give them a round of applause, if you could. Since we have three enthusiastic teams to present, we'll just take 2 or 3 sort of rapid comments on here. In the lightning round, we also did some sort of general discussion. Any builds on this, particularly with how it impacts the research recommendations for the collaborative going forward? Any quick builds and adds to this? Oh, right on my side here, Lynn.
Hi, thanks for that. I'm really interested in your patient registry, and has there been some thought? We do we're thinking now a lot of times of going for natural history studies or observational research type of studies, using these types of registries for sightless trials, where literally it's a patient is, a nurse goes to the home, there's literally no site involved. Have you guys done something like that before, or?
We have not used, we have a clinical network that we've developed around the country and 3 other countries. So we always use those for our clinical trials, but we have not done the home studies yet. But we're open to it. Yeah.
Great. So that would be something even to research and advance and build out. Any other builds and additions for this? Nina, I see you moving.
Yeah, that's the question.
Well, please.
Hi, this is Nina Aluwalia from Genentech. Thanks for the presentation. I was curious, you mentioned that you gather patient input on tolerability of assessments in the trial. And I'm curious if you've worked with sponsors that they want to do the right thing and go along with that feedback, but due to clinical or safety needs or maybe feedback they're getting from the FDA, they can't quite meet the patient need, and how you kind of help them meet in the middle, or what kind of compromises you end up with.
Anyone from the table, or Ron?
sense?
I think that might have been directed at your particular organization.
I'm not sure I quite understood the question. Could you take one more crack at it?
Sure. So a little bit more specific, meaning like if you're getting patient feedback to say that a certain assessment is really burdensome for them, but maybe the clinical trial team you're working with from a sponsor is telling you, well, we need that assessment because it's really important for safety reasons. How do you sort of create a balance there?
Yeah, we haven't really faced that particular issue, but what we're constantly doing is looking for additional measures to put into our natural history study, so that, for example, the new technologies for wearables and carryables, that can report on, back to your question about the way the patient feels and functions on a daily basis in their own environment, So we would need to add that to our natural history study to have that baseline, if you will. And so we're constantly looking for, and we just added a hearing measure, and we're trying to add a speech measure. So as our sponsors tell us, well, we'd like to really work on hearing, or we'd like to work on speech, we're trying to accommodate that within our natural history study, and it would be added to the patient registry, which is really a contact registry plus enough inclusion exclusion.
And I think that could be a wonderful add-on as well on the research on this mindset of the trial designers and the training the scientists to understand and value this, and that's both FDA scientists as well as company. Quick follow-up, Donna and Carlin, and then Roz, is that you in the back?
So this is Donna Cryer, Global Liver Institute. So my answer to that in the short term is that is a role that some of the advanced patient advocates, patient scientists, play in reconciling the patient needs and concerns with those, and pushing back perhaps on your clinical team, but also understanding the regulatory environment and helping the 3 sort of sides of this find a compromise that gets the data but also meets some of those needs. So I think that is an excellent role for the patient leaders and partners in these research.
And could that be something that gets researched as well, as to what are the best mechanisms for that kind of 3-way discussion to happen? I don't know that we have great sociological research on that, but not my field, right? Yeah, Hildy, real quick response.
So I call that the 3rd way, because part of the training of the research advocate is to understand you have to level set expectations. Every idea that you have is not going to come to fruition, but there is a way to create a 3rd way. So sometimes there is a really legitimate safety reason. The advocate may gain a better understanding of that, and the researcher may understand the pain involved in getting that information, and sometimes they come to a compromise to make it a little bit less painful, whether it's time, actual real pain, whatever it is. And so I have seen many really great compromises. So it's really about how you have the conversation.
Okay. So Carlin, and then Roz will have final word, and we'll move on to table 7. All right?
Carlin Schrader, Parkinson's Foundation. That is essentially what I was going to say.
Carlin, it's just been a hard day for you.
But to add to that, I think that speaks to the importance of training patients about the research process. It doesn't have to be a 3-day or a 5-day training. I just think anytime you speak with patients, you have to set that expectation of there may be things that we can't change. And it's still the role of the patient to push back on that, but for them to understand why a certain statistical design matters. The average person does not know that, so maybe explaining that up front can help people to understand why in some cases the change can't be made.
Roz, final word, comment.
So Roz Schneider from Pfizer. I think in addition to training the research advocates about those expectations, it's also a matter of training our internal teams to push back on ourselves to say, are we saying we can't do it because there is a specific regulation or there is a specific safety concern, or are we saying we can't do it because we've always done it that way? Yeah. Specifically, we had that experience with a washout period for a particular program where we had patient input, where the advocates said, if you shorten it, you'll have a much better chance that people might be interested in participating, because this is too long for somebody with this particular illness. And explain to me, like a 4-year-old, why it has to be this duration. And really it was something that the team then considered and said, we can make it shorter. And so it's that distinction between why we can't or wouldn't change something and not to be resistant to thinking out of the box based on the input that we're getting.
Nina, really quick.
Thank you so much for all the comments. I definitely agree. And I just wanted to add a request for the FDA, if I could. I think that sometimes the perceived resistance within a company of the clinical team is because they perceive that the FDA wouldn't accept this novel design. Oh, the FDA is going to want us to have all these safety measures in place, and we have to have 10 MRIs, as we talked about at our table. So the more clarity we can get of how you guys will consider patient input and how that will weigh in your decision-making around our trial designs would be really helpful.
Right, or even joint approaches. And Laura from the FDA, I have to give
Laura Lee Johnson with the FDA, and may I please ask every single one of you, a lot of times we hear one KOL kills it for exactly the same types of things you're saying. When you come and ask the FDA, encourage people to come and talk to us, because many times we do not have the perceived notions that everybody thinks we have. And even if you heard it 3 years ago, come talk to us now. We may have a different thought on it. Come talk to us. Push it. Everybody in this room, online, come talk to us and get the current.
Very good. That's wonderful advice. I know from the work we've done at MIT, NewDigs, Center for Biomedical Innovation, we had much of the same thing. People would say, regulators require this, and we had the EMA, the FDA, Health Canada, Health Singapore in the room. They all said, oh, no, we don't. Right? And it's because of everyone wants to make sure that it's really clean, so they get more and more conservative. It's in economics, we call it this agency problem again, right? And I think part of what the research is here could be showing the value of face-to-face joint collaborative discussions instead of a lot of single discussions, which is how the process sometimes works, right? That could be a wonderful thing, do a controlled study of how that game happens, right? Table 7, you are up. Who's your speaker? So TJ, introduce yourself.
TJ Sharp, patient experience advisor, and I am representing Table 7. We picked the measuring trial participant experience because we knew Table 3 would take the first 2 for us. So I'm going to try to quickly go through some of these. There's a lot that we came up with in how measuring the experience would affect the science of patient input. The purpose and use of potential impact, highlighted 2 of them. Understanding how trial design affects recruitment, enrollment, and retention, and then how that trickles down the cost and time savings, which seem like 2 very big carrots to dangle when speaking about this particular engaging patient initiative. And then related to that would be patient engagement impact on the trial itself, measuring the before and after, the design versus the execution comparison, and seeing if what we wanted to achieve in involving patient design actually bore fruit when you measure that experience from a patient standpoint. As far as the methods go, we have a bunch of them on here: adaptive trial design, integrative efforts to measure the burden of data gathering. The one I did highlight was the continuous trial checkpoints or check-ins, so that we don't need to wait till the end of a trial to figure out if what we're doing is right. There's no reason not to continuously monitor how we're doing. We do it for the medical data. Why not do it for the experience? There's a bunch of gaps and some barriers as well. The first gap is the lack of comprehensive data on the experience itself. There is some that exists out there, but I would say compared to the amount of trial and medical data we have, it's significantly smaller and unexplored, certainly not socialized. And a couple of biases or barriers that we have is some biases: selection bias and technical barriers into getting into populations, into all representative populations, whether it be someone who does not have access to the technology that would help us measure, or the technical actually being able to use a device that would make this data gathering easier. Then there's things like survey fatigue, loss to follow up, and survivor bias. All three of those impact what kind of data we get, because it's going to give us, again, not a full picture of what all patients are experiencing across the entire trial. From a non-scientific part, the lack of a baseline. There really isn't a baseline for a patient experience. It's just sort of what we think patients want or are going through. And the other big thing we saw as a gap is the caregiver and family input. That the patient, the trial participation experience doesn't just affect the trial participant. And when we do survey, it does seem like we ask the patient, how did this go for you? What did it go? What did you do? What's your experience with it? But a trial doesn't impact just that patient. So there's a very big gap in getting the impact it has on others that are involved in the trial in relation to the patient. Target audience stakeholders for future research. I kind of summed it as standardize it, analyze it, and socialize it. Standardize healthcare and trial metrics. We want to be able to measure similar things the same. It doesn't do us any good if we're all trying to measure the level of a success for a trial, and we're using different scales or different ways of describing the same measure. Then coming up with a way for meaningful analytics to measure, something that will not just give us a result, but actionable items that we can say, this needs to improve and there's a way to improve it. And then finally, one of the things that we discussed, we need to share it. Because if one company or one organization has this data, even if it doesn't seem like it's connected, if breast cancer and lupus are measuring similar things for a trial experience, it might not appear that there's a connection there, but most likely there is. So not just sharing it with the people who you feel are in the same bucket or boat, but really across the clinical trial and the healthcare world, so everyone can learn from the strides that are made and the mistakes that we can improve on. And that's it.
That's a lot.
Yeah, I'm not even in the yellow yet. We're good.
That's it. That's a lot. Congratulations. Well done. Again, themes of standards, although not ethical standards at this point, but standards of outputs, sharing, dissemination, building capabilities, common themes we've heard all day in various ways. Great stuff. Feedback, so Suzanne, you seem to be first. I see Carlin again. Nope, that was left over. All right. Suzanne, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, Sue's with the Arthritis Foundation. I just wanted to sort of endorse the method of adaptive trial design, kind of pick up on what Roz was saying earlier about washout periods, but kind of even go to the holy grail of placebo. What we have, and I know I'm not supposed to be disease specific, but I'm going to go rogue. In inflammatory diseases, what we have right now is a situation where the only patients who are signing up for clinical trials are the ones for whom everything else has failed. We don't know why they've failed, and we can't, account for that variable. So what's the level of evidence we're even getting in this clinical trial? So it's just, what can we do to move away from kind of this traditional study model? So I just double endorse, and I won't make Laura Lee repeat her earlier statement. We definitely see kind of going and partnering with the FDA as the way to get better designs.
Excellent. Follow up over here.
Domitila from Avalier Health. I just wanted to follow up on a few things, but we talked a lot at our table about continuous learning and a little bit about adaptive learning, and I think one thing that comes to mind, probably as a future research thing, is the fact that I think a lot of the issues that are important to patients from an experience perspective and ultimately from an enrollment and retention perspective are probably also parallel to a lot of the things that are important to them in accessing any healthcare option more broadly. So some of the things that we heard earlier around, burden on family members, like cost of travel, need for child and elder care. So I think, I guess an area of research potentially is, how do we really ensure that what we learn from patients' experience in clinical trials is used to inform ultimately the endpoints that we're measuring and then sharing from clinical trials.
And sharing beyond into patient access and
right.
payer coverage and reimbursement
That's
is
right.
what I think I heard you hinting at.
Yep.
Is that correct?
Yep.
That's a great way to transition all this. And Laura, did you want to say something more?
Sure, and I'm actually going to theme off of the
and I need
adaptive
you to
trial
introduce because the transcriber
I'm sorry,
will have
that's right.
forgotten
I
who
should
you
know
are.
this by now. Laura Lee Johnson with the FDA. The adaptive trial design and some of the earlier discussions to say, okay, we're broadening our inclusion-exclusion criteria. One thing, as someone who has to kind of scope out these designs, is thinking about even if you're doing non-inferiority studies, for example, the margins may come into question here. And so this is another part, thinking as early as phase 1 and especially during phase 2, figuring out what information do you need to know in order to actually design these trials well, because the expansion is good, but if you don't have that knowledge, you might not be able to actually have an adequately designed, like, what is the non-inferiority margin? It's really just a wild guess, and that's not what you want to do going into studies. And so these are issues to work in as you're making these adjustments. There's a lot of extra information we need to.
Wonderful. And again, showing how partnering with the FDA can be very helpful. Arthur, are you going for that sign there? All right.
I'm just wondering...
Arthur, you got to say your
Arthur
name.
Stone. I'm just wondering, has this industry thought yet about presenting prospective patients with vignettes about what a trial might be like in order to elicit from a representative sample of potential patients what they think their compliance will be, what they think the barriers to completion of the trial will be, and then to feed back that information back to the trial designers so that they could modify it in order to make the most efficient trial. Maybe that's being done. I don't know. But it seems like a good idea.
Well, so we've got it captured now. It's great. Kevin, final comment, and then James, you might be the speaker for Table 9. We'll go right into you.
I'm going to speak from some experience I did. I actually did a survey of people about kidney disease clinical trials. But I think the secret sauce is trying to understand the people that have that bigger mission that was mentioned earlier.
That Joy talked about, right?
That's the thing that I think that is really the key, is trying to get people to have that perspective of recognizing it's not for themselves and how they carry the mission forward. That, to me, is the key.
Right. And that could even be a line of research of showing advocates who have that versus those who don't, and levels of impact. That could be
and how you communicate with them too.
James, you've got final comment on this one, and then Table 9 is up.
Sure. So James Valentine, Hyman Phelps, and McNamara. I just wanted to tag on to the comment about doing kind of broader work with like vignettes ahead of getting specific feedback on a particular protocol with a limited population. I actually think there might be an opportunity for patient advocacy organizations to be able to do that. Groups like Farah around Bartek's group, who are routinely called in to weigh in. They might actually have more insights onto what are the interesting and important questions to ask of their patient community that another company who in a rare disease might have no actual experience designing those studies could really benefit from that kind of information. So
again, we've got the sharing component, right? And how can the research program really build those network capabilities and resources going forward? Excellent work. Wow, you guys are keeping the energy up, I must admit. It's 4:15 and you guys are still really energetic and with it. Who's our spokesperson?
Hi, Marnie Hall from Acuvia. Acuvia is the new name for the companies that were IMS and Quintiles now merged.
So we'll just call you Prince from now on, and the company's formerly known as.
Okay, so we rolled up and talked about protocol development and recruitment, enrollment, and retention kind of together. We were thinking about in terms of how we wanted to, the purpose and the impact is aimed at improving the efficiency of data capture to address several research questions and to lower costs and efficiencies so we can ask longer term safety and effectiveness questions and do that by design from the beginning. So some of the methods and tools that we talked about employing would be to have virtual, so Lynn, to what you were saying, some virtual trials and site list design elements, as well as enriched studies that would include PROs and EHR and claims data in order to enrich the information that we had during a trial in order to allow things like subpopulation analyses to be able to learn more and cover a more generalizable population. We also talked about having extension studies in order to keep patients enrolled as trials are ending in order to maintain engagement with them, to learn more around their experience on their drug longer term or experience in order to do post-market safety studies or effectiveness studies and to learn about those experiences without having to go back and re-recruit or contact patients. A lot of these extension studies can be done direct to patient or in with call centers and have limited sites, fewer sites that are going on. And then we also talked a little bit about the use of real-world comparators later on and using natural history controls in order for label expansion. So some of the technical needs that we talked about were clinical validation of the events of interest, data standards and ontologies for the systematic and structured data capture for post-market information, and then the integration of these types of data together. Some of the non-technical aspects that we talked about were in order to have the right consent and site selection processes in place early on in order to maintain and optimize that efficiency, the data governance around to address the use and reuse of data as these studies continue to go on, and then also to be able to identify sites and perhaps the right academic medical centers where off-label use could be most easily identified.
You're complete. I thought you might have had another roll. That's great.
Yep.
Are you done?
I'm done.
I didn't want to rush you. All right.
Thanks.
Very good. Responses. So it echoed some of the comments we heard earlier about get the data standards right first, right? And that the broader research agenda should really include that, as well as a number of other things that were new and novel. Any other comments or follow-on? Yeah, James, support your team there.
James Valentine, Hyman Phelps, and McNamara. One other thing that we talked about in terms of kind of fully utilizing the patients that you already have enrolled would be to incorporate some of either patient preference or some other questionnaire methodologies to help you not only, what was mentioned, which was the assessment of, the product itself, but actually to help you do a post-mortem on the success of the study. So that way you can actually learn, not just kind of survey people ahead of time on what they think would be kind of beneficial to protocol design, but actually evaluate and kind of empirically look at the successes and the failures within a particular completed or near completed extended study. So that's kind of an opportunity that we identified as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for adding that in. Great stuff. So we're in the final 5-10 minutes of this session. I'd like to go to a bit of a speed round or lightning round. Are there ideas or proposals for the research agenda, which is what we're about, that you'd like to get in here at the last minute, right? So, question here. Carlin, thank you.
I keep knocking things down. Carlin Schrader, Parkinson's Foundation. Just thinking about next steps, I think the next evolution of patient engagement and research would be including patients in more of the science. So, for example, psychometric testing when developing PROs and rash modeling. So I think we said in the beginning, patients, not in the beginning of this meeting, in the beginning of patient engagement, patients can educate their communities about trials, but they can't really help with protocol. And say, they can help with protocol. And then we said they can actually help with designing the protocol. And we keep pushing how far back in the process and how sophisticated, if you will, we can go with patient engagement. So I know in the UK, they're actually doing this type of work of engaging patients in statistical modeling and things like this. So I think that may not be happening as much in the US, and we should think about that as a next step.
That's wonderful. Rachel, you're next, and then Mary.
I just want to put on the table patients as owner of their data, so not only about their experience, but also owners of their data, and thinking about the new frontier in terms of clinical trials, so ways to really engage patients to be owners of their EHR data, their claims data, other types of data. There are pioneering efforts out there right now to sort of mobile health applications that allow patients to consent to their data being used for clinical trials and with researchers. So I think sort of thinking more broadly about where's the future of clinical trials and what are we looking at in the future in terms of different designs for trials. So that
for this research agenda, that goes back to Cindy's comments just before lunch about certain standards to be set and patient access and privacy concerns, sort of that standard as well as being just sort of in all the research that's done.
Correct, but
understanding your comment?
It's also about putting the patient at the center of the trial in a way that's, it's not just honoring their participation in the trial and their experience in the trial and their PROs. It's also about the patient really being at the nexus of all the data that's actually required to do a full clinical trial, so follow up. So I think there's a lot of kind of bright spots in the future of clinical trials, but we're not quite there yet. So that's why it's on the research agenda piece.
Thank you so much for clarifying. Is that a quick follow-up, Teresa, to this, or should I put you in queue? Put you in the queue. So we have Mary, and we have Carol, and we have Teresa, we have Ron, and we have Cindy. And someone help me remember that order. All right, Mary.
Mary Tobin Acres. I think one thing that we do need to keep in mind is that historically, both for the feds as well as for this industry, change is very difficult and often resisted. And so I always find it very sad when someone from either a sponsor or a CRO says, we have this great program we've developed, it's a nice pilot, the one group we've tested it with loves it, but I can't push it out into the company. And the reason that they can't is because there's no organizational change effort that's gone along with it. And so while we have all these wonderful ideas, I think if we don't take that part into account, then a lot of these great ideas are not going to go anywhere.
That would be great also to have in the research of organizational change in the context of the dissemination and sharing, certainly. Do you have a quick follow-up on that, Kevin? Or did you have something different?
Yeah, Kevin Fowler, Kidney Health Initiative. My request is that there's a way to measure the progress, that we put together these standards and guidelines, and then how that's being accepted within the community. I'm not aware of that existing. That's
Great.
My request.
So the queue I have is Carol and Teresa. I've got Ron. I have Cindy. I have TJ. Did I miss anyone? Carol, you're up then.
Carol Meyer, Takeda Pharmaceuticals. I think the one thing that we brought up as an opportunity is figuring out how do we navigate all the legal requirements for industry to talk to patients. Every time we get together with patients, every patient requires a legal contract. So the complexity of engaging patients is extremely high, and we need to figure out a way to make that easier for us to gauge, groups of patients effectively.
Right. May not quite be research, but researching what even the standards or the commonly accepted forms, like when I sell a house and the real estate person gives me this big long thing. All right, Teresa.
Okay, so to the extent that there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a research to be done, and we don't want to have people reinvent the wheel, we want to be more standardized. I think it might be important not only to have a location or locations, a finite number of locations for repositories, but actually some templates or fairly standardized structures for those interim work products to make them easy to access and use. So not only referenced by disease, but really people know what they're going to likely find and what's going to be in there, and can make ready use of them, and really that'll help sort of increase utility and access to that information. The other thing I just would add to Mary's comment is that I would completely agree with that regulators and companies may be among those that need organizational change, but we really get an earful when we hear from patients about the healthcare delivery system too. So my guess is you can't stop there. It probably has to go all the way out to the point of care, as well.
Excellent. Ron, you're up, and then Cindy. Nope, she doesn't need it. So then we'll go to TJ and Kevin. Ron?
I just want to, this is Ron Bartek, Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance. I wanted to add a vote of confidence and applause to some things you've heard from our FDA colleagues today. And it would really provide an important backdrop for these research agendas. That is that this is not your grandmother's FDA. This is Teresa Mullen's FDA. Teresa mentioned this morning in her presentation what we consider a really vital element in this new FDA, and that is these externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. Teresa led that effort beginning in 2012 to develop these meetings, and they are just powerful. Absolutely powerful. They make two things clear in our experience. One is that the FDA is genuinely, as Lauren indicated earlier, listening to our patient's voice. And the result of these externally led meetings is what's called the Voice of the Patient report. I've seen FDA review division directors hold up these Voice of the Patient reports and say that this is changing the way that we are conducting our business, our reviews of these disease groups, and reading to the public emails they sent to their review divisions later that day saying, this is what we heard from the patient today. It's going to make me cry. You guys are awesome. And so the other thing it makes clear is the flexibility that you've heard our colleagues mention. This is an amazing era. Our regulators could not be in a better place for our submissions. So I want to thank you for your flexibility and listening. So.
Thank you, Ron, for sharing. TJ.
I'll follow up that heartfelt thing with something you can do about it. We've just listened. We've heard this word earlier, and now in this last session, I hear help, involve, engage, advise, things that patient and patient advocacy groups can do. The word I didn't hear in the last 45 minutes was partner. Industry partners with the FDA. They partner with CROs. They partner with sites. They partner with payers. Partner. Use that word. Bring it back. I'm preaching to the choir here, but when you go back to your organization and you start hearing patient advisor, patient engagement, push back and say, no, the patients are our partners in this, and we need to engage them the same way we engage each of these other stakeholders in clinical development.
That, I think, could be the two best closing statements of the session possible, so let's call it a wrap on that. Thank you very much.